They said the boy should have run. They said no 8-year-old in his right mind would step toward a woman chained to a tree wearing the colors of the most feared motorcycle club in America. But what Ethan Walker did in the woods behind Pine Ridge, Tennessee, would shake the brotherhood of the Hells Angels to its core, and within days bring 3,000 riders thundering into a town that had never seen more than a tractor parade. It started on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late October, when Ethan, small for his age but stubborn, in the way only country-raised kids can be, wandered past the old logging trail, searching for his lost beagle. The cicadas screamed in the heat, their song rising and falling in waves that seemed to pulse with the thick air. The woods smelled of sap and damp earth and something older, the accumulated decay of 1,000 autumns compressed into soil that fed the towering oaks and maples. Ethan had been calling for a copper for the better part of an hour, his voice growing hoarse, his throat scratchy from shouting the dog's name into an indifferent forest. The beagle had a habit of chasing rabbits, losing himself in the pursuit until he'd wandered miles from home, only to show up hours later with burrs in his coat and that sheepish look dogs get when they know they've worried their people. But this time felt different. The woods were too quiet beyond the cicadas. No rustling in the underbrush. No distant baying as copper treed some unfortunate squirrel. Just the thick, pressing silence of a forest holding its breath. When Ethan heard the sound at first, he thought it was the wind catching in hollow bark. The old logging trail was full of dead trees, their insides rotted out, creating natural flutes that moaned when the breeze hit them just right. But then it came again, unmistakably human. A word barely audible pushed through cracked lips with the last reserves of strength. Help. Most kids would have bolted. Pine Ridge wasn't the kind of place where strange voices in the woods led to happy endings. This was a town that remembered when old Mr. Henderson had gone missing on a hunting trip, and they'd found him 3 days later, hypothermic and delirious, talking to trees he thought were his dead wife. This was a place where parents warned their children about the dangers of wandering too far, where the forest was respected and feared in equal measure. But Ethan had been raised by Margaret Walker, a woman who believed in two simple, unbreakable rules. Don't lie and don't leave someone hurting if you can help it. Those rules had been hammered into him since he was old enough to understand words reinforced every Sunday at the Pine Ridge Community Church, where his grandmother taught Sunday school and preached a gospel of practical kindness. So instead of running toward safety, Ethan ran toward the sound. He pushed through thick brush thorns, catching on his worn jeans and scratching lines of red across his forearms. His heart hammered against his ribs, fear and adrenaline mixing into a cocktail that made his hands shake and his vision sharpen to crystal clarity. The trees opened into a clearing he'd never seen before, though he'd walked these woods 100 times. Sunlight slanted through the canopy in golden bars, illuminating a scene that would be burned into Ethan's memory for the rest of his life. A woman in torn black leather wrists shackled with heavy chain to a towering oak that must have been growing since before Tennessee was a state. Her boots were caked in dried mud, her jeans ripped at both knees. Dark stains that could only be blood spreading across the denim. One eye was swollen nearly shut, the flesh around it purple-black, the kind of bruising that spoke of violence delivered with intent. Her lip was split, dried blood crusted in the corner of her mouth. Her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. But what caught Ethan's attention, what made his stomach drop and his fear spike from manageable to overwhelming, was the patch on the back of her vest. Red and white against black leather. The winged skull unmistakable, even to a child who'd only seen it in passing, on roaring bikes at gas stations, on the backs of men his grandmother told him to stay away from in news reports about gang violence in Memphis and Nashville. Hells Angels. The woman's head lolled to the side, tracking the sound of Ethan's arrival, with the eye that could still open. For a moment, they just stared at each other. A beaten woman chained to a tree, and a small boy who'd followed a sound into a nightmare. Her lips moved, forming words that took 3 tries to vocalize. Kid, she rasped, her voice like gravel scraped across concrete. Run. They might still be close. The words should have sent Ethan sprinting back the way he'd come. Should have triggered every survival instinct an 8-year-old possessed. But something in her eyes stopped him. Not threat, not danger, just resignation. The look of someone who'd already accepted that this was how her story ended, alone and afraid in the Tennessee woods, chained like an animal and left to die slowly. Ethan had seen that look before. In the mirror the night his parents died. In the weeks after, when grief sat on his chest like a physical weight, and he'd wondered if he could just stop breathing, stop trying, stop hurting, he recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in dark water. His legs trembled, but not from the urge to flee, from the sheer impossibility of the choice in front of him. Run and save himself, or stay and maybe save her. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head, the same lesson she'd taught him 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. Don't leave someone hurting if you can help it. Ethan took a step forward instead of back. The woman's one good eye widened slightly, surprise, breaking through the pain. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I said run. You look thirsty," Ethan said, his voice barely steady. The observation was simple, factual, the kind of thing an 8-year-old notices because the world hasn't yet taught him to look past the obvious to the complicated truths beneath. He shrugged his backpack off his shoulders, the faded blue canvas printed with cartoon dogs that he'd begged his grandmother for last Christmas. His hands fumbled with the zipper, trembling so badly it took 3 tries to get it open. Inside, wrapped in a paper towel that was now damp with condensation, was a bottle of water, half empty from the morning's walk to school, warm from sitting in his backpack all day, but water nonetheless. He twisted the cap off and approached carefully the way you would approach a wounded animal, telegraphing his movements so she could track them. He held the bottle up to her lips. The chains clinked as she shifted, trying to raise her head enough to drink. Pain flashed across her face, a wince quickly suppressed, but Ethan saw it. He stepped closer, lifting the bottle higher, tilting it carefully so the water flowed into her mouth without choking her. She drank in small sips at first, then longer pulls, desperation taking over. Water spilled down her chin, cutting clean tracks through the dirt and blood on her face. When the bottle was empty, she slumped back against the tree, breathing hard, and closed her one good eye. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered after a long moment. The question held genuine confusion, as if kindness from a stranger was a concept so foreign she couldn't process it. Ethan shrugged in that simple, matter-of-fact way that would later be repeated on every news channel in the state, analyzed by psychologists, trying to understand what makes a child capable of heroism. "'Cause you need it," he said. The answer was so simple it felt stupid even as he said it, but it was the truth. She needed help. He could help. The math was that straightforward. He noticed the bruises on her arms, then deep purple welts that ran from wrist to shoulder, some overlapping evidence of sustained beating. The raw skin where metal had bitten into flesh, rubbing the skin away until it wept clear fluid that mixed with dried blood. Her knuckles were split and swollen defensive wounds from trying to protect herself before they had overwhelmed her. "Did someone do this?" Ethan asked, another stupid question. Obviously someone had done this. People didn't chain themselves to trees and beat themselves unconscious. But he needed to hear it, needed her to confirm what his eyes were showing him. She gave a faint, humorless laugh that turned into a cough. "Yeah," she managed when she could speak again. "Bad men who think fear makes them powerful." Her voice held contempt, now cutting through the pain. "Thought they could send a message by leaving me here. Thought nobody would find me before I died." Ethan didn't fully understand biker rivalries or territory wars, didn't understand the complex web of alliances and grudges that governed the world of motorcycle clubs. But he understood wrong, understood hurt, understood that leaving her there wasn't an option, no matter how scared he was, no matter how much easier it would be to pretend he'd never heard her voice in the first place. "Stay here," he said, then immediately realized how stupid that sounded. She was chained to a tree. Where else was she going to go? "I'm going to get help." Her hands shot out as far as the chains would allow, reaching for him. "Kid, wait. What's your name?" Ethan Walker." "Okay, Ethan Walker. You need to be careful if they're still around, if they see you." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. "I'll be careful," he promised, already backing toward the tree line. "What's your name, Raven?" "Raven Sterling." "Okay, Miss Raven. I'll be right back. I promise." He turned and ran. The trip back to the dirt road felt longer than the trip in every shadow, a potential threat, every snapping twig, the sound of footsteps following. Thorns scraped his arms, drawing fresh blood that he barely noticed. His heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears, a drumbeat that said, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." When he broke through the tree line onto the dirt road, the afternoon sun hit him like a physical blow after the dimness of the forest. He fumbled in his pocket for the cracked prepaid phone, his grandmother insisted he carry just in case. The screen was scratched, the case held together with duct tape, but when he pressed the power button, it lit up showing half battery and 1 bar of service. His fingers shook as he dialed 911, the numbers were burned into his memory from the safety lessons at school, from the fire department visits, where they made every kid practice calling for help. But this wasn't practice. This was real, and the weight of that reality made his hands tremble so badly he almost dropped the phone. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Please answer," Ethan whispered to the phone, to God, to anyone who might be listening. "Please." 911, what's your emergency?" A woman's voice said, calm and professional, and completely unaware that the person on the other end was an 8-year-old boy who just found something he shouldn't have seen. "There's a lady chained to a tree." Ethan blurted the words, tumbling out in a rush. "She's bleeding. She can't get loose. She needs help right now." A pause. Then the dispatcher's voice, still calm but with an edge of intensity beneath the professional veneer. "Okay, sweetheart, I need you to take a deep breath. Can you tell me your name, Ethan Walker?" "Okay, Ethan, that's good. You're doing great. Can you tell me where you are?" "Behind Miller's old logging trail, near the creek bend. You know where the big oak tree fell across the path last winter?" "Past that, maybe a quarter mile." "Okay, and you said there's a woman chained to a tree?" "Yes, ma'am. She's hurt bad. Her face is all beat up, and there's blood, and she's chained with real chains, like the kind you use on a trailer. She can't get free. Is she conscious? Can she talk?" "Yeah. She told me her name. Raven. Raven Sterling." Another pause, longer this time. Ethan could hear keyboard clicking in the background, the dispatcher typing notes or running a search, or doing whatever dispatchers did when an 8-year-old called to report finding a woman chained in the woods. "Okay, Ethan. Help is on the way. I need you to stay where you are." "Okay, don't go back to her. Stay on the road where it's safe." "But I told her I'd come back." Ethan, the dispatcher's voice was firm now, the professional calm cracking slightly to show the concern beneath. "I need you to stay safe. The officers will be there in less than 10 minutes. You did the right thing calling us. But now I need you to wait on the road." Ethan looked back at the tree line, at the gap in the brush where he'd emerged. Raven was in there alone, probably terrified he'd abandoned her, like whoever had left her chained in the first place. "I have to go back," he said quietly. "I promised." He hung up before the dispatcher could argue, silencing the phone and shoving it back in his pocket. Then he turned and ran back into the woods. The second trip was faster. He knew the path now could follow his own broken branches and disturbed leaves like a trail of breadcrumbs. When he burst back into the clearing, Raven's head lifted, her one good eye tracking his arrival with something that might have been hope. "You came back," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. Like people coming back was something she'd stopped expecting long ago. "I promised," Ethan said simply. He dropped to his knees beside her, breathing hard from the run. "Help is coming. Police and ambulance. They'll be here soon." "How soon?" The lady said, "Less than 10 minutes. That was maybe 3 minutes ago." Raven nodded, then winced at the movement. Her breathing was getting more labored, each inhale a visible effort. "Listen to me, kid. When they get here, you tell them what you found. You tell them I'm Hell's Angels. You tell them to call my husband. His name is Jackson Sterling. People call him Hawk. He's with the Tennessee chapter." "Okay, Mr. Hawk, Tennessee chapter." "And Ethan." She caught his eyes with her one good one. "You did good, real good. Most grown men wouldn't have done what you just did. My grandma says you help people who are hurting. That's just what you do. Your grandma's a smart woman." They sat in silence after that, Ethan close enough to reach out and take her hand if she needed it, far enough not to crowd her. The forest around them continued its afternoon song. Cicadas, birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Normal sounds in an abnormal situation. The sirens started faint, growing louder. First one, then another joining it, then a third. The cavalry arriving in force. Ethan could hear them coming up the dirt road, tires crunching on gravel, engines revving. "They're here," he told Raven. She nodded, her eye drifting closed. "Stay with me," he said suddenly, fear spiking through him. She looked so pale, her breathing so shallow. "Don't go to sleep. The lady on the phone said you're not supposed to sleep if you're hurt." "Not sleeping," Raven murmured. "Just resting my eyes. Hurts to keep them open." "Then just rest them." But keep talking to me. Okay, tell me about your husband. Hawk. A ghost of a smile crossed her battered face. He's gonna lose his mind when he finds out about this. He's protective. Probably tear apart 3 states looking for the guys who did this. Will he find them? Oh yeah, Hawk always finds what he's looking for. Boots crashed through the underbrush, men shouting. Deputy Sheriff's Office, a voice called. Anyone there? Here, Ethan yelled back. We're here. 3 deputies burst into the clearing, hands on their weapons, faces showing a mix of professional alertness and genuine shock at the scene in front of them. A woman chained to a tree, beaten to hell, and an 8-year-old boy sitting calmly beside her like this was the most natural thing in the world. Jesus Christ, the lead deputy breathed. He was older, maybe 50, with gray threading through his brown hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades working outdoors. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, we've got confirmation. Adult female restrained, visible injuries. Get EMS in here now. The other 2 deputies moved forward, one pulling bolt cutters from his belt, the other kneeling to assess Raven's injuries with the careful efficiency of someone who'd done field triage before. The lead deputy turned his attention to Ethan. Son, are you hurt? No, sir. You're Ethan Walker, the boy who called this in. Yes, sir. That was real brave what you did. Coming out here calling for help. You probably saved this woman's life. She said her name is Raven Sterling. She's with the Hells Angels. Tennessee chapter. Her husband's name is Hawk, and you need to call him. The deputy's expression shifted, professional mask slipping for just a second to show surprise and something else. Concern, maybe? Or calculation? Understanding that this wasn't just a random assault, but something that would have consequences rippling far beyond Pine Ridge. We'll make sure he's notified, the deputy said. But right now, I need you to wait over there while we help her. Okay? Ethan nodded and moved to the edge of the clearing, watching as the deputies worked. The one with the bolt cutters made short work of the chains, the metal parting with sharp cracks that echoed through the forest. Raven slumped forward as soon as she was free, would have fallen if the other deputy hadn't caught her. Easy, the deputy said gently. We got you. You're safe now. Paramedics arrived minutes later, running into the clearing with a stretcher and equipment bags. They moved with practiced efficiency, taking vitals, starting an IV. Asking questions, Raven answered in a voice so quiet Ethan could barely hear it from where he stood. They lifted her onto the stretcher, securing straps across her body. As they prepared to carry her out, Raven's head turned, her one good eye finding Ethan. She lifted her hand, beckoning him closer. Ethan looked at the lead deputy, who nodded. Go ahead, son. He approached the stretcher. Raven's hand, the one without an IV, reached out and caught his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who'd been chained in the woods for God knew how long. Tell him, she whispered, her voice rough but urgent. Tell Hawk a kid didn't run. Tell him Ethan Walker stayed. Promise me. I promise. Good boy. Her grip loosened, her hand falling back to the stretcher. Her eye closed. The paramedics lifted her, carrying her toward the trail, toward the ambulances waiting on the dirt road, toward hospitals and police statements, and a reckoning that would shake 2 states. The lead deputy walked Ethan out of the woods. What's your grandmother's name, son? Margaret Walker. She lives on Willow Creek Road. We'll give her a call. Let her know you're safe. You did real good today, Ethan. Real good. But Ethan barely heard him. He was thinking about Raven's words. Tell him a kid didn't run. Like that mattered. Like in a world full of people who looked the other way and minded their own business and chose safety over kindness, staying was something remarkable enough to mention. It would be hours before he understood just how remarkable. Before he learned that what he'd done in those woods would change not just his life, but the life of an entire town. Before 3,000 motorcycles descended on Pine Ridge like a thunderstorm made of chrome and leather, all because an 8-year-old boy had heard someone call for help and decided that running wasn't an option. But in that moment, walking out of the woods with a deputy's hand on his shoulder and the afternoon sun slanting through the trees, Ethan just felt tired. Tired and scared and desperately hoping he'd done the right thing. They didn't know then that Jackson Hawk Sterling, Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels Tennessee chapter, was already tearing across state lines after hearing his wife had gone missing. They didn't know that encrypted phones were lighting up across the South with a message that would travel faster than wildfire. They didn't know that within hours the machinery of brotherhood would grind into motion, planning something Pine Ridge had never seen and would never forget. An 8-year-old boy saved one of ours. In the ICU waiting room that night, Ethan sat swinging his feet from a plastic chair while adults whispered in tight circles around him. His grandmother had arrived within 20 minutes of the deputy's call, bursting through the doors, with her white hair wild and her face pale with fear that only eased slightly when she saw him whole and unharmed. She'd hugged him so tight he couldn't breathe, her small frame shaking, and he'd realized she was crying. "I'm okay, Grandma," he'd whispered into her shoulder. "I'm okay, I promise." But she'd held on for a long time anyway, like she needed to physically confirm he was real and present and not disappeared into those same woods. Deputies questioned him gently after that, asking him to walk through the timeline. What time he'd left school, when he'd noticed Copper was missing, how long he'd been in the woods before he heard Raven. The questions were repetitive, circling the same events from different angles, and Ethan answered patiently, even though all he wanted was to go home and curl up in his bed and sleep for about 100 years. News crews began gathering outside. Margaret could see them through the emergency room windows, satellite trucks with their tall antennas, reporters checking their hair in compact mirrors, cameramen testing angles and lighting. The story was spreading. Small-town boy finds Hell's Angel's wife chained in woods. It had all the elements of viral news: violence, innocence, motorcycle gangs, and an ending that, at least so far, didn't include anyone dying. A doctor emerged from the restricted area still wearing scrubs, a surgical mask pulled down around his neck. He looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd done difficult work and succeeded. "Mrs. Sterling is stable," he announced to the waiting room at large. "She's sustained significant trauma, broken ribs, orbital fracture, severe contusions, signs of dehydration and exposure. But she's going to recover. Whoever found her and got her help, they saved her life. She wouldn't have lasted another night out there." Maggie's hand found Ethan's shoulder, squeezing gently. "That was my grandson," she said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and residual terror. "He found her. He called 911. The doctor looked at Ethan, really looked at him, seeing past the small 8-year-old body to whatever it was that had enabled him to do what most adults wouldn't. "You're a brave young man," the doctor said. "What you did today mattered. Don't ever forget that." But Ethan was already forgetting, or trying to. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving him hollow and shaky. His arms stung where the thorns had scratched him. His throat hurt from yelling for Copper, who still hadn't come home. Everything felt distant and unreal, like he was watching it happen to someone else on a television screen. Sheriff Roy Bennett arrived around 8 o'clock. He was a big man, tall and broad, with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much over too many years. Vietnam veteran Maggie had told Ethan once, though she'd never elaborated on what that meant beyond a general sense that the sheriff had been to war and come back changed. Bennett's hand shook slightly as he held his coffee cup. Not from age, though he was pushing 75. The tremor was constant, something Ethan had noticed before but never understood. PTSD, though Ethan wouldn't learn that term for years. "Mrs. Walker," the sheriff said, nodding to Maggie. Then to Ethan, "Listen, I need to ask you some questions about what you saw today." They had already been through this with the deputies, but Ethan understood that repetition was part of the process. He walked Sheriff Bennett through it again. The woods, the sound, finding Raven chained to the oak, the call to 911, staying with her until help arrived. "Did she say who did this?" Bennett asked. "Did she mention any names?" "No, sir. Just that it was bad men who wanted to send a message." "Did you see anyone else in the woods? Any motorcycles? Any vehicles?" "No, sir. Just her." Bennett nodded, making notes in a small, spiral notepad he'd pulled from his shirt pocket. "And she asked you to tell her husband, Jackson Sterling." "Hawk." "Yes, sir. We've contacted the Hells Angels Tennessee chapter. Mr. Sterling is en route from Nashville. Should be here within the hour." "Is he mad?" Ethan asked. The question surprised him even as he asked it, but suddenly it seemed important to know. Was Hawk Sterling angry at him for finding his wife in such a state, for seeing her vulnerable and broken? Mad? Bennett's expression softened. "No, son, I don't think he's mad. I think he's going to want to thank you." But beneath Bennett's calm exterior, Ethan could see calculation happening. The sheriff was already thinking ahead, already worrying about what happened next. Because Hells Angels didn't just say thank you with words, they said it with action. And action from one of the most powerful motorcycle clubs in America could mean a lot of different things, Not all of them good for a small town that valued peace and quiet above all else. 3 counties away, in a dimly lit clubhouse that smelled of motor oil and old leather and decades of cigarette smoke absorbed into the walls, Jackson Hawk Sterling stood in the center of a room that had gone absolutely silent. He was 45 years old, built like something that had been carved from stone and taught to move. 6'2", 230 pounds, most of it muscle earned through years of physical labor and maintained through the kind of discipline that came from Marine Corps training. His face was weathered-lined around the eyes and mouth, the map of a hard life lived outside. His beard was dark with threads of gray, worn long and occasionally braided. But what held the room's attention weren't his physical attributes. It was his eyes. Blue-gray like storm clouds capable of warmth, but currently burning with an intensity that made grown men nervous. Those eyes had seen 3 tours in Afghanistan, had seen friends die, had killed when killing was necessary. And right now they were processing information that made the muscles in his jaw work and his hands curl into fists. His wife had been found chained to a tree in the woods, beaten, left to die, live only because an 8-year-old boy had hurt her and stayed instead of running. The room held 40 riders, men and a few women who had been with the Tennessee chapter for years, some for decades. These were people who'd ridden together, fought together, mourned together when brothers were lost to accidents or violence or the slow grind of age and hard living. They were family in a way that transcended blood. Bear Thompson stood to Hawk's right, 6'4", 300 pounds, arms like bridge cables covered in tattoos that told stories in ink and scar tissue. He'd been Hawk's best friend since they'd met in a bar fight in Memphis 15 years ago. Ended up on the same side against a group of drunk college kids who didn't understand that mouthing off to bikers was a bad idea. Wrench Carlson was there, the chapter's best mechanic, a thin man with quick hands and a mind that could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Sweet Marie, one of 3 women who wore the full-patch former Army medic who could stitch up a knife wound or strip an engine with equal skill. 40 men and women who lived by a code that outsiders didn't understand and didn't need to. Her name's Raven Hawk, said quietly, though everyone in that room already knew. And she's alive because an 8-year-old boy named Ethan Walker didn't leave her to die alone. The room remained still. No one revved engines or shouted promises of revenge. This wasn't that kind of moment. This required something different, something that would match the magnitude of what had happened. The boy's name is Ethan Walker Hawk, continued, and Ethan could hear the emotion beneath the control. Lives with his grandmother in Pine Ridge, Margaret Walker. Lost both parents 4 years ago in a car crash. He's small for his age. Gets bullied at school. And when my wife, beaten and chained to a goddamn tree, told him to run, told him to save himself, he gave her water instead. He called 911. Then he went back to her, stayed with her until help arrived. Bear shifted his weight, the only sound in the room. What are we doing? Hawk looked at him, then at the faces around the room. Veterans, mechanics, fathers and mothers, and people who had built families within these walls because their own had fallen apart or never existed in the first place. We ride, Hawk said. To Pine Ridge, Bear asked. To Pine Ridge, to thank a child who reminded us what this patch is supposed to mean. Hawk tapped his chest over the red and white emblem that marked him as Hell's Angels. That patch didn't mean violence or lawlessness or any of the things the news said it meant. It meant brotherhood. It meant loyalty. It meant that when someone saved one of yours, you never forgot. But the question hanging in the air was how. How did 36 bikers show up in a small town to thank an 8-year-old without terrifying everyone in a 50-mile radius? How did you honor courage without looking like you were staging an invasion? We go in peace, Hawk said, reading the unspoken concern. We show that town what happens when someone saves one of ours. We show them who we really are. Not what the news says, not what the movies show, what we actually are. Brothers, sisters, family, people who believe in honor. The vote was unanimous. Within the hour, encrypted phones were lighting up across the South. Chapter presidents receiving messages, members being contacted, logistics teams mapping routes. The machinery of the Hells Angels network grinding into motion with the efficiency of an organization that had been doing this for 70 years. By Thursday evening, conservative estimates put the expected turnout at over 1,500 riders. By Friday morning, it had doubled. Riders were coming from as far as Texas and the Carolinas. Men who had never met Raven Sterling but understood the principle at stake. A child had stayed when everything said to run. That meant something. Messages flew across the network. Memphis chapter confirmed 80 riders. Birmingham sent word they were bringing 120. Chattanooga was scrambling to get as many as possible. Even the California chapters 3,000 miles away were calling to see if they could make the ride in time. But along with the mobilization came a message that Hawk sent personally to every chapter president. We ride in peace, no weapons, no intimidation, no bullshit. We're going to show Pine Ridge who we are when we choose to be. Anyone who can't follow that stays home. The response was almost universal agreement, because while the Hells Angels had a reputation for violence, had earned that reputation in turf wars and conflicts that stretched back decades, they also had a code. And that code said you honored courage. You protected the vulnerable. You stood up for what mattered. And an 8-year-old boy who'd saved one of theirs, that mattered more than anything. In Pine Ridge, the news spread like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest. By Thursday morning, everyone knew that Ethan Walker had found a woman chained in the woods. By Thursday afternoon, everyone knew the woman was Hell's Angels. By Thursday evening, rumors were flying that bikers were planning to come to town. Sheriff Bennett called an emergency town meeting Thursday night. The community center filled to capacity, 300 people crammed into a space designed for 200, everyone talking at once, fear and speculation feeding on each other until the room hummed with anxiety. Bennett stood at the front waiting for quiet. When it didn't come naturally, he whistled sharp and loud, cutting through the chatter. The room settled. Thank you, Bennett said. I know you're all concerned. I know you've heard rumors, so let me give you facts. He outlined the situation. Ethan Walker finding Raven Sterling. The woman being airlifted to Vanderbilt Medical Center in Nashville. The Hells Angels being notified. And yes, the possibility that club members would want to come to Pine Ridge to thank the boy. How many, someone shouted from the back. How many bikers are we talking about? Bennett's jaw tightened. Current estimates are around 3,000. The room erupted. 3,000. That's more people than live in this town. They'll destroy us. They'll burn everything down. What are we supposed to do? Just let them invade? Bennett raised his hands, calling for calm. Listen to me. I've been in contact with the chapter leadership. They've given me their word. This is peaceful. They want to honor Ethan. That's it. They're not coming for revenge. They're not coming to cause trouble. But can we trust them? Mrs. Dillard called out. She ran the corner diner, had lived in Pine Ridge for 60 years, and her voice carried the weight of community elder. Can we trust bikers? The question hung in the air, and Bennett found himself without a good answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He'd dealt with individual bikers before. Mostly on traffic stops or noise complaints, but 3,000, that was an army. That was a force that could overwhelm the town by sheer presence alone, peaceful intentions or not. What choice do we have? Bennett said finally. They're coming, that's happening. The question is how we respond. Do we treat them like enemies before they've done anything wrong? Or do we give them the same chance we'd give anyone else? The meeting broke up with no clear consensus. Some people wanted to close businesses, board up windows, prepare for the worst. Others argued for normalcy, for treating the weekend like any other. Very few suggested that maybe the bikers deserve thanks for not retaliating violently against whoever had hurt their member. At the Walker farmhouse on Willow Creek Road, Maggie sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. She'd raised her grandson to help people, had drilled that lesson into him with the same fervor her own mother had used on her. Do right by people, show kindness, don't turn away from suffering. And he'd done exactly that. He'd heard someone in pain and helped. And now there were 3,000 motorcycles heading to their tiny town, and she had no idea if she should be proud or terrified or some complicated mixture of both. She heard the stairs creak and looked up to find Ethan standing in the doorway in his pajamas, the ones with the dogs printed all over them that were getting too small, but he refused to give up. Can't sleep, baby? She asked gently. He shook his head, crossing to the table and climbing into the chair next to hers. His legs swung, not quite reaching the floor. Grandma, did I do something bad? The question hit her like a physical blow. Oh, sweetheart, no, you did something incredibly brave and good. Then why is everyone scared? I heard you on the phone with Mrs. Dillard. She said the bikers are going to destroy the town. Maggie chose her words carefully. People are scared because they don't understand. They hear motorcycle gang and they think violence. They think danger. But that's not fair, is it? To judge someone before you've met them. That's what you always tell me. Don't judge people by how they look. Exactly. And the bikers, they're coming because you saved one of their family. That's a good thing. That shows they care about each other, that they're loyal. Those are good qualities. So we shouldn't be scared. Well, she hedged, maybe a little nervous is okay. 3,000 is a lot of people. But scared like we need to hide, no. I don't think so. I think we wait and see. Give them a chance to show us who they are. Ethan nodded slowly, processing. Well, I have to talk to them, Mubby, if you want to. But nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do. Okay, he slipped out of the chair and hugged her, his small arms wrapping around her neck. Love you, Grandma. Love you too, baby. More than anything. She watched him pad back upstairs, listened to his door close, and then dropped her head into her hands and prayed. Not to ask for protection or for the bikers to stay away, just for wisdom, for the ability to navigate whatever came next, for her grandson to stay safe in a world that was suddenly much more complicated than it had been a week ago. Friday morning brought the first signs of the approaching storm. Sheriff Bennett received a call at 6 a.m. from the Highway Patrol. Motorcycle convoy entering from the west on Highway 41. Estimate 200 riders, more convoys reported from the north and south. Bennett dressed quickly, skipping breakfast, and drove to the station. His deputies were already there looking nervous. Deputy Marcus Cole Young, and eager and prone to seeing everything as a potential threat, was practically vibrating with tension. Sheriff, we need to talk about tactical response. If things go bad, if they start trouble, we're outnumbered 50-1. Bennett held up a hand. Stand down, Marcus. We're not treating this like a hostile force unless they give us reason to. But sir, no. We're going to be professional and calm. We're going to monitor the situation. And unless someone breaks the law, we're going to let them do what they came here to do. Am I clear? Marcus nodded reluctantly. The other deputies looked relieved. They were small-town cops. Writing speeding tickets and breaking up the occasional bar fight was more their speed than facing down a biker army. Bennett set up a command post at the abandoned fairgrounds just outside town. It was a large open space, mostly dirt and scrub grass, where the county used to hold an annual fair before budget cuts killed the program. Big enough to hold 3,000 motorcycles. Isolated enough that if things went wrong, the town proper wouldn't be immediately affected. He called the lead number Hawk had given him. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. This is Hawk. Mr. Sterling, this is Sheriff Bennett. We spoke earlier this week. I remember, Sheriff. How's my wife improving? She's stable. Doctors say she'll make a full recovery. A long exhale on the other end of the line. Relief that was almost palpable, even through the phone. That's good. That's real good. I'm calling about the gathering this weekend. I wanted to coordinate logistics with you. We appreciate that, Sheriff. We want this to go smooth. They talked for 20 minutes, parking arrangements, timing, the plan for Hawk and a small delegation to meet with Ethan and his grandmother. The promise repeated multiple times that this was peaceful, that any member who caused trouble would be dealt with by the club before the law got involved. One more thing, Sheriff Hawk said before they hung up. I know this is a lot for your town. I know you're probably getting pushback. But I need you to understand something. That boy saved my wife's life. In our world, that's a debt that can't be repaid, only honored. We're coming to honor him. Nothing more, nothing less. I believe you, Mr. Sterling. Bennett surprised himself by meaning it. There was something in Hawk's voice, a sincerity that cut through the tough guy biker exterior. I just hope your brothers feel the same way. They do. I made sure of it. Anyone who doesn't is staying home. They hung up. Bennett sat at his desk, staring at the phone, and wondered if he was making the right call. If he was putting his town at risk by allowing this. If 30 years of law enforcement experience was telling him the truth when it said these men were coming in peace. He thought about his own time in Vietnam, about the bonds formed between men who'd faced death together, about how that brotherhood transcended everything else, became more important than country or politics or anything the outside world valued. If the Hells Angels had even a fraction of that same bond, then maybe this really was just about honoring courage. Or maybe he was a foolish old man who'd lived too long in a small town and forgotten how dangerous the world could be. Either way, they'd know by Sunday. The first convoy reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge at 6:12 Saturday morning, just as the sun was breaking over the eastern hills. Mrs. Dillard, who'd risen early to prep the diner for what she expected to be either the biggest day of business in years or the last day before retirement, stepped outside with her coffee mug and froze. A line of headlights stretched as far as she could see down Highway 41. Not individual lights, but a river of them flowing toward town in tight formation. The sound built slowly, a rumble that started below the range of hearing and climbed steadily until the coffee in her mug began to vibrate, tiny ripples crossing the dark surface. She stood transfixed, unable to move as the lead motorcycles crested the hill and descended toward town. Chrome caught the early light and threw it back in spears of brilliance. Black leather absorbed the sun. And the noise, God. The noise grew until it wasn't sound anymore but a physical presence, a force that pressed against her chest and made her heart adjust its rhythm to match. The convoy passed without stopping, following Highway 41 toward the fairgrounds. Dozens of bikes, then hundreds, all moving with precision that spoke of planning and discipline. No showboating, no revving, just steady progress toward a destination. Mrs. Dillard fumbled for her phone and called her daughter. "Betty," she said when the call connected, voice shaking. "They're here, Lord have mercy, they're here." By 7 o'clock, the sheriff's office had confirmed what the state troopers were already reporting. Motorcycle convoys were entering from 3 directions, and conservative estimates put the number well over 2,000 riders. By the time the final wave crossed the county line, it was closer to 3,000. News vans that had been camping in town since Thursday went into overdrive. Reporters did stand-ups with the stream of motorcycles in the background, struggling to be heard over the engine noise. Helicopters circled overhead, cameras capturing aerial footage that would be broadcast nationally before noon. Social media exploded. Biker Army invades Tennessee town. Hell's Angels descend on Pine Ridge. 3,000 riders for one boy. The story was too good not to share, too compelling not to click on. Within hours, Pine Ridge was trending on Twitter, climbing the Facebook algorithm, dominating regional news. But what the breathless coverage missed, what the terrified speculation overlooked, was what actually happened when 3,000 bikers arrived in Pine Ridge. They parked. In the massive dirt lot of the fairgrounds, they arranged their motorcycles in precise rows. Not scattered haphazardly, but organized with military efficiency. Cruisers here, touring bikes there. The vintage restoration projects given pride of place near the front. Each rider dismounting, removing their helmet, setting it carefully on their handlebars. The engines cut in near-perfect unison. 3,000 motorcycles falling silent together, the absence of sound almost as overwhelming as the noise had been. And in that sudden quiet, Ethan sat at his kitchen table eating cereal and watching his grandmother pace. "That's a lot of motorcycles," he observed, voice mild, as if 3,000 bikers gathering a mile from their house was just another Saturday morning event. Maggie stopped pacing long enough to look at him, this small boy who'd somehow become the center of a storm he didn't fully understand. "You scared?" Baby Ethan thought about it, actually considered the question seriously. A little, he admitted, but also kind of excited. "Is that weird?" "No, sweetheart. That's not weird at all." At the fairgrounds, Hawk stood at the front of the formation, his presence commanding without a single raised voice. Beside him stood Raven, released from the hospital against medical advice, one arm in a sling but upright and unbroken. Her face still showed the damage, bruises yellowing at the edges, the white of her injured eye bloodshot. But she'd insisted on being here. Had said that if 3,000 brothers and sisters were riding to honor the boy who saved her, she damn well was going to be present to say thank you herself. Sheriff Bennett approached cautiously, flanked by deputies who were visibly outnumbered, but trying to project professional calm. Bennett had put on his dress uniform for this, the one he wore to funerals and formal county events. If this was going to be a significant moment in Pine Ridge history, he wanted to look the part. "Mr. Sterling," Bennett said, extending his hand. Hawk shook it, his grip firm, but not crushing. "Sheriff Bennett, thank you for allowing this. I appreciate you coordinating with us. Makes everyone's job easier." Bennett glanced at the rows of motorcycles, the sea of leather and chrome. "That's impressive organization." "We take this seriously, Sheriff." Hawk's voice was steady, the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. "This isn't a rally or a party. This is about honoring a debt. Bennett studied him, reading body language and tone, applying 3 decades of experience in judging people. What he saw was sincerity, fierce, uncompromising sincerity. These men really had ridden hundreds of miles just to thank an 8-year-old boy. We'd like to visit the boy and his grandmother, Hawk continued. Just me, Raven, and maybe 2 others. Keep it small, respectful. We don't want to overwhelm them. I think that would be appropriate. Bennett paused, then asked the question that had been nagging him since this all started. Why all this for one kid? Hawk was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. Because most people, when they see someone in trouble, they look away. They tell themselves it's not their problem. They choose safety over kindness. And I get it, the world teaches you that. Your wife, though, he gestured to Raven, she was chained to a tree, beaten, left to die. And an 8-year-old boy heard her and didn't look away. Didn't choose safety. He stayed. In our world, Sheriff, that means everything. Bennett nodded slowly. All right, let me call Mrs. Walker. Let her know you're coming. The call was brief and awkward. Maggie's voice tight with nerves, agreeing to the visit, but making it clear that if Ethan felt uncomfortable at any point, she'd end it immediately. Bennett assured her that was absolutely her right and gave her his direct number just in case. At the Walker farmhouse, Maggie hung up the phone and turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, still wearing his pajamas. That was the sheriff, she said. Some of the bikers want to come say thank you. You okay with that? Ethan nodded. How many? Just 4. The husband and wife and 2 others. Okay. Should I change? Yes, baby. Let's get you in real clothes. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat on the living room couch wearing jeans and his nicest shirt, the blue button-down Maggie had bought him for Easter. His hair was combed, his face washed, his hands scrubbed clean of the dirt that perpetually seemed to accumulate under his fingernails. Copper had finally come home that morning, muddy and exhausted, and now lay at Ethan's feet like a furry sentinel. The knock came at 8:03, firm but not aggressive. Maggie opened the door to find 4 people on her porch. 2 men and Raven, all of whom removed their sunglasses simultaneously in a gesture that seemed choreographed, but was probably just habit. Mrs. Walker, the larger of the 2 men, said. His voice was deep, the kind that vibrated in your chest. My name is Jackson Sterling. People call me Hawk. This is my wife, Raven, the woman your grandson saved. Maggie's hand tightened on the doorframe. Is she all right? I'm getting better, Raven said. And Maggie was struck by how young her voice sounded. Not physically young, Raven was clearly pushing 40, but there was a gentleness there that didn't match the hard exterior. Thanks to your grandson. Come in, Maggie heard herself say, stepping back. Please. They entered, carefully moving with the deliberate slowness of people in someone else's space. Bear Thompson had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. Wrench Carlson, thin and wiry next to Bear's bulk, kept his hands visible and his movements minimal. They understood that their size and presence could be intimidating. Were actively working to be smaller, quieter, less threatening. Ethan stood when they entered the living room, Copper immediately growling low in his throat. Hush, Ethan said quietly, and the dog subsided, though he kept his eyes on the strangers. Hawk crossed the room and did something that surprised everyone. He lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself to eye level with Ethan. Up close, Ethan could see the lines around his eyes, the scars on his knuckles, the small tattoo on his neck that looked like coordinates. But mostly he saw Hawk's eyes, blue-gray and intense, but not unkind. You're the one who didn't run, Hawk said. It wasn't a question. Ethan shrugged, the gesture automatic. She was thirsty. A flicker crossed Hawk's face, something between disbelief and respect and maybe pain, the realization that his wife had been reduced to a state where being given water was an act of profound kindness. My wife is alive because of you. I just called 911. You did more than that, kid. You stayed with her. When you could have saved yourself when she told you to run, you stayed. She looked scared, Ethan said simply. My grandma says nobody should be alone when they're scared. Hawk glanced at Maggie and she saw him understand. Saw him piece together the grief in this house, the lessons learned from loss, the way trauma had shaped this small boy into someone who stayed when others ran. Can I show you something? Hawk asked, returning his attention to Ethan. The boy nodded. Hawk reached into a leather bag he'd been carrying and pulled out a vest. Small, clearly made for a child, black leather worked soft and supple. He turned it around to show the back. A single patch, beautifully embroidered honorary guardian above the image of a shield. Below it, courage before fear. In our world, Hawk said carefully, when someone risks themselves for one of ours, we honor that. This isn't membership. You're 8 years old, way too young for that, and that's not what this is about anyway. This is a promise that we see what you did, that we remember, that you matter to us. Ethan looked at the vest, then at his grandmother. Maggie felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was more than a piece of clothing. This was an invitation into a world she didn't know from people she had every reason to fear based on everything the news had ever told her about motorcycle clubs. But then she looked at Raven, really looked at her, saw the bruises and the bandages and the way she held herself like someone who'd been broken and was determined not to show it. Saw how Raven's eyes kept going to Ethan with an expression Maggie recognized because she'd worn it herself. The look of someone who'd lost something precious and found an unexpected second chance. "It's up to you, sweetheart," Maggie said softly. "Will it fit?" Ethan asked, practical as always. Hawk's hands, scarred and massive, shook slightly as he helped Ethan slip into the vest. It hung a little big on his small frame, the shoulders too wide, the hem reaching past his waist. But somehow, impossibly, it looked exactly right, like armor made specifically for him. Ethan turned back around and looked down at himself, running his fingers over the leather. "It's nice," he said quietly. "Thank you." And then Jackson Hawk Sterling, Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels, Tennessee chapter, a man who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and 15 years in one of the most dangerous motorcycle clubs in America, a man who'd killed when necessary and never lost sleep over it, broke down completely. He pressed his face into his hands and wept. Not quiet tears, but full body-shaking sobs, all the fear and rage and relief of the past week pouring out in Maggie Walker's living room, while an 8-year-old boy stood there in an oversized vest, confused but patient. Bear Thompson stepped forward, placing a massive hand on Hawk's shoulder. The other two looked away, giving their brother privacy in his grief. And Maggie understood in that moment that these men weren't what the news said they were. They weren't monsters or criminals or whatever scary label got slapped on motorcycle clubs. They were fathers, brothers, men who had found family in unexpected places and protected it with everything they had. "I'm sorry," Hawk managed, finally wiping his eyes roughly. "I'm sorry, it's just, you're so young, and you did something so—" Brave Ethan offered quietly, remembering what his grandmother had told him. Hawk laughed a broken sound. "Yeah, kid. Brave." He stood slowly, composing himself, rebuilding the walls that had cracked. He looked at Maggie. "There are 3,000 riders at the fairgrounds right now. They all came to say thank you, to honor your grandson. We'd like to bring him to meet them if that's okay with you. No pressure. If you'd rather we just leave him be, we'll respect that." 3,000, Maggie repeated faintly. She'd known the number intellectually. Hearing it was different. "Yes, ma'am. They'll park at the fairgrounds. We won't come into town unless invited, and we'll leave tomorrow morning, peaceful as we came. But we needed you to know. We needed Ethan to know that what he did, it mattered. It matters to all of us." Ethan looked up at Maggie, his eyes asking permission. She looked down at her grandson, this small boy, who'd already been through so much, who'd lost his parents and rebuilt a life, and now stood at the center of something huge and terrifying, and maybe, just maybe, beautiful. "Okay," she heard herself say, "but I'm coming with him, and if at any point he wants to leave, we leave." No argument. "Absolutely," Hawk agreed immediately. "This is for him, whatever he wants." They drove to the fairgrounds in Hawk's truck, Maggie and Ethan in the backseat, Raven up front. The ride was quiet. Ethan stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass, seeing his small town through new eyes. Everything looked the same but felt different, like reality had shifted slightly off-center. As they approached the fairgrounds, Ethan could see the motorcycles. Row after row after row of them stretching to the horizon, chrome and steel and leather. Hundreds of people standing beside their bikes waiting. "That's a lot," Ethan whispered. Raven turned in her seat. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to, sweetheart. We can turn around right now if you're scared." But Ethan shook his head. "I want to see." They parked at the edge of the lot. Hawk came around to open Ethan's door, helping him down from the truck. Maggie followed her hand, finding Ethan's shoulder, needing the physical connection. Then came the moment no one expected. Hawk stood and turned toward the assembled riders. He lifted his hand, once a simple gesture. 3,000 engines roared to life in unison, a sound so powerful it shook the ground beneath their feet. The noise rolled across Pine Ridge like a living heartbeat, rattling windows in towns, sending birds exploding from trees and panicked clouds. And then just as suddenly, silence. 3,000 engines cutting simultaneously, the absence of sound almost painful after such volume. In that sudden quiet, Hawk handed Ethan a small portable microphone. "There are 3,000 people here who came because of what you did," he said gently. "And they'd like to hear from you, if you're willing. You don't have to, but if you want to say something, anything, they're listening." Ethan took the microphone. It was heavy in his small hand, the weight of expectation suddenly very real. He looked at Maggie, who nodded encouragement. Then he raised it to his lips. Hi." His voice echoed across the fairgrounds, amplified by speakers positioned throughout the lot. 3,000 people remained absolutely still, watching this small boy in an oversized vest, waiting. "My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 8. His voice gained a bit of confidence with each word. "And my grandma says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you help people even when you were scared." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "If you came here because you think I was brave, then you have to be brave too. You have to help people. You have to be kind, because that's what brave really means." He lowered the microphone, unsure if he'd said the right thing, if he'd somehow messed up this moment. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats that felt like forever. Then Hawk lifted his hand and brought it down in a sharp motion. 3,000 engines roared to life simultaneously. Not a sustained roar, but a single unified thunder that split the air and shook the earth. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence again, the message delivered without words. "We hear you. We understand. Your words matter." In the ringing silence that followed, Hawk turned to the assembled riders and spoke into his own microphone, his voice carrying across the valley. "You heard him, that was all. No speech, no explanation, just 3 words that carried the weight of command and transformed a child's request into law for 3,000 people. Over the next 6 hours, Pine Ridge witnessed something unprecedented, something that would be studied and analyzed and still not fully understood by people who hadn't been there to see it. The riders dispersed into town in small groups, always respectful, always careful. They filled Mrs. Dillard's diner until she ran out of bacon and eggs and had to call in her daughter and 2 grandchildren to help cook. They ordered everything on the menu, left $100 under $5 cups of coffee, and waved away change. When Mrs. Dillard tried to refuse the tips, a gruff man with a gray beard and kind eyes said, "Ma'am, your coffee's worth it. Don't argue with me." At Miller's gas station, they filled their tanks methodically, waited patiently in lines that stretched down the block, and tipped the attendants more than the gas cost. When 17-year-old Tommy Miller nervously admitted he was saving for college, 3 bikers quietly handed him $200 each before riding away. At the elementary school, a group of mechanics noticed the broken playground equipment and set to work without being asked. Tools appeared from saddlebags like magic. Within 2 hours, they'd repaired the broken swing set, replaced rotted boards on the jungle gym, and were debating whether the seesaw just needed oil or complete replacement. Principal Anderson, watching from her office window, walked out to thank them. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Yeah, we did." A woman with short gray hair and a scar across her left cheek replied. "Kid who saved Raven probably played here. That makes it matter." Sheriff Bennett's aging patrol car, which had been making concerning noises for months, found itself surrounded by bikers who insisted on diagnosing the problem. By noon, they'd replaced the alternator free of charge using parts they had somehow procured from their mobile workshop, refusing payment or even a receipt. "How much do I owe you?" Bennett asked. "Mine, Sheriff. You let us come in peace. That's payment enough." And at the fairgrounds, donation boxes appeared. Simple cardboard boxes at first labeled in marker for Pine Ridge kids. Cash accumulated. 10s and 20s, then hundreds. One woman removed a gold necklace from around her neck and dropped it in without ceremony. A man added a Rolex watch. Another contributed a cashier's check for $5,000. By 2 o'clock, the boxes had been replaced with lock boxes as the amounts became too large to leave unsecured. Sheriff Bennett stood, staring at the total climbing past $87,000, unable to process the number. "This can't be real," he muttered. "It's real," Bear Thompson said from behind him. "We take care of our own, and that kid, he's ours now." But something else was happening beneath the surface of money and repairs and diner tips. Something quieter but perhaps more significant. At the VFW hall, a gathering had formed organically. 20 bikers, most of them wearing service medals on their vests alongside the club patches. Marine Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force. Men and women who'd served before they had ridden. And sitting with them were local veterans. Harold Martinez, who'd been in Korea. Tom Bishop from the Gulf War. James Crawford, who'd done 2 tours in Iraq. And Sheriff Roy Bennett, who found himself drawn to the building by something he couldn't name, some pull toward voices speaking a language he'd tried to forget. He stood in the doorway, watching and listening. They were swapping stories. Not the heroic bullshit civilians wanted to hear, but the real stories. The boring ones, and the scary ones, and the ones that didn't make sense unless you'd been there. Hawk Sterling sat at a table with Harold Martinez, and Bennett heard himself approaching before he consciously decided to move. "First Infantry," Harold was asking, leaning forward with interest. "Third Marines," Hawk replied. "3 deployments to Helmand Province. Rough country. The worst. Lost 6 brothers my first tour alone." Bennett pulled up a chair without being invited, the kind of presumption that came from recognizing your own tribe. "Roy Bennett," he said, extending his hand to Hawk. "First Infantry, too, but a different war." Hawk's eyes widened slightly with recognition and respect. "Vietnam, Da Nang, 1970 to 72. The conversation shifted, then becoming something Bennett hadn't experienced in decades. The easy shorthand of men who'd seen combat, the dark humor that covered pain too deep for civilian words, the respect that came from knowing someone else had stood where you'd stood and somehow made it home. "You ever get the shakes?" Bennett asked quietly, surprising himself with the admission. His hands were trembling, now the tremor he usually tried to hide, suddenly visible on the scarred wooden table. Hawk held up his own hand. It trembled slightly, a mirror of Bennett's. "Every day. Worse when it's quiet. Nightmares. Like clockwork. 2-3 times a week. My wife, she's learned to wake me gentle. Loud noises, sudden movements, that's bad." Bennett felt something crack open in his chest. 54 years. 54 years he'd carried this alone, convinced that admitting weakness would make him less than whole, that a sheriff couldn't show vulnerability. But here was this man, this biker he'd feared just hours ago, sharing the same burden. "Thank you," Bennett said roughly, "for being honest." Hawk met his eyes. "Brotherhood doesn't end when the war does, Sheriff. It just finds new forms." And in that moment, Roy Bennett understood what was really happening in Pine Ridge. This wasn't an invasion. It was a homecoming. These men had found family in each other the same way he'd found it in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They protected their own. They honored their code. They were brothers, just wearing different colors. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it meant the bikers really were here in peace. Unsettling because it meant Bennett had spent 50 years running from the very thing these men had embraced. "We meet every Thursday," Bennett heard himself say, "right here, VFW Hall. War vets, coffee and bullshit mostly. But it helps, having people who understand." He paused, then took a chance. "You'd be welcome. Any of your brothers who served." Standing invitation. Hawk's expression softened. "I appreciate that, Sheriff. I really do." They sat together for another hour, veterans of different wars finding common ground, and when Bennett finally stood to leave, his hands were steadier than they'd been in years. At the Walker house, Maggie found herself hosting an unexpected guest. Raven had asked permission to stay, to spend time with Ethan, while Hawk handled logistics at the fairgrounds. And despite every reservation, every warning bell going off in her head, Maggie had said yes. Now they sat on the back porch watching Ethan throw a tennis ball for Copper in the backyard. The beagle bounded after it with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age, and Ethan laughed, and the sound was so pure and joyful that both women smiled despite themselves. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable, not awkward or tense, but settled, like 2 people who'd found themselves in the same boat and were making the best of it. "You lost a child," Maggie said quietly. It wasn't a question. Raven's hands tightened on her coffee mug, the knuckles going white. 7 years ago. Miscarriage at 20 weeks. We'd already picked a name, Claire. Already painted the nursery yellow because we wanted to be surprised by the gender. She paused, staring into her coffee like it might hold answers. The doctors said I couldn't have more children after that. Something about the complications, scarring. I'm sorry. How did you know? Maggie smiled sadly. I know that look. I see it in my own mirror every morning. I lost my son 4 years ago. Ethan's father, him and his wife both. Car accident on I-40. Drunk driver crossed the center line. They died instantly. That's what the highway patrol told me. Like that was supposed to make it easier. God, Maggie, I'm so sorry. They sat with that for a moment, two women who understood the weight of absence, the particular grief that comes from losing someone who was supposed to outlive you. Does it get easier? Raven asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question. A desperate need to believe that this pain wouldn't last forever. No, Maggie said honestly, but you learn to carry it differently. You find reasons to keep going. She gestured to Ethan, who was now letting Copper climb on him, both of them covered in grass and dirt and dog slobber. He's mine. He's special. The way when I was in those woods, I'd given up. I really had. Thought that was it, that I was going to die alone and scared, and they'd find me weeks later when someone wandered too far off the trail. But then he appeared, this tiny kid with a backpack and a water bottle, and he just stayed, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's what his father was like, Maggie said softly. Always helping, always putting others first. He volunteered at the fire department, coached Little League even though Ethan was too young to play. Just wanted to help the community. I like to think some of that lives on in Ethan. Raven wiped her eyes, the tears cutting clean tracks through the dust the wind had kicked up. When I held his hand in those woods, it was the first time since losing Claire that I felt connected, like maybe I wasn't completely broken. Like maybe there was still good in me worth saving. She turned to look at Maggie. I know this is strange. I know you don't know me, but I need you to understand. What your grandson did, it saved more than my life. He reminded me why life is worth saving. Maggie felt tears spill over hot and sudden. Then I'm glad he found you. Because he needs that too. Needs to know that helping matters. That courage counts for something. That the world isn't just taking and never giving back. It counts for everything, Raven said fiercely. And I swear to you, Maggie, on everything I hold sacred, we will never let him forget that. That boy is family now. Our family. And we protect family. They sat together as the afternoon light shifted, as shadows lengthened, and the Tennessee heat began to ease two women from completely different worlds, discovering they spoke the same language of loss and love and desperate hope that tomorrow might hurt a little less than today. Inside the house, Maggie's phone rang. She excused herself to answer, leaving Raven on the porch. It was Sheriff Bennett. Maggie, you might want to turn on the news. She did, and found herself staring at aerial footage of Pine Ridge. The fairgrounds packed with motorcycles in perfect formation. Downtown bikers mingling with townspeople, shaking hands, helping repair buildings, buying food at prices that left change jars overflowing. Donation boxes being lifted by two men each, so heavy with cash they couldn't be carried solo. The headline read, Biker Gang Transforms Tennessee Town with Acts of Kindness. They're not what we thought, Bennett said over the phone, and there was wonder in his voice. They're not what I thought. Maggie watched Raven through the window, saw this bruised, broken woman laugh at something. Ethan said saw her grandson respond without a grin that lit up his whole face. No, she agreed quietly. They're not. As the sun began to set on a day that had changed Pine Ridge forever, Hawk returned to collect Raven. But before they left, he pulled Maggie aside while Ethan was upstairs changing out of his grass-stained clothes. I need you to know something, Hawk said quietly, his voice low enough that only Maggie could hear. We've got intel that the Black Vipers know we're here. The gang that hurt Raven, they're watching the news coverage and they're angry. Angry that we turned their message of fear into something beautiful. Maggie's blood ran cold. You think they'll come here? I think there's a possibility. We've got security watching. Bennett knows we're being cautious, but I wanted you to hear it from me. He met her eyes. If anything happens, our priority is protecting this town, protecting Ethan. We didn't come here to bring violence. But if violence comes to us, we'll handle it, and we'll make sure your grandson and this community stay safe. Why? Maggie asked the question, bursting out before she could stop it. Why risk so much for people you don't know? Hawk smiled, and it transformed his face from intimidating to almost gentle. Because Ethan taught us something we'd forgotten. That the strongest thing you can do is protect what's good in this world. And right now in this town, there's a whole lot of good worth protecting. As the bikers settled in for the night, camping at the fairgrounds, with the permission of the town council, Pine Ridge transformed. Fear had given way to curiosity. Curiosity to conversation. Conversation to understanding. Families who'd locked their doors that morning found themselves inviting bikers to dinner. Mrs. Patterson served pot roast to 4 riders who helped her elderly father fix his roof. The Johnsons shared their barbecue with a group who'd been admiring their restored Mustang in the driveway. Food and stories and laughter flowing between people who 12 hours ago had been strangers, divided by fear. But 3 counties away, in a dark clubhouse that smelled of smoke and rage and old beer, Colt Harper stared at news footage of Hell's Angels being welcomed in Pine Ridge and felt his vision turn red. They think they're heroes now. He spat, his voice carrying the edge of violence barely controlled. Because of that fucking kid. His lieutenant, a man named Voss with a teardrop tattoo and dead eyes, nodded slowly. What do you want to do? Colt smiled, and it was the smile of something that had learned to look human but never quite mastered the expression. We remind them what fear looks like. Tomorrow morning, when they think they're safe, when that whole town is gathered together celebrating their peace and love bullshit, we burn it down. How many men? 18, armed. We hit them at dawn. Maximum casualties. Show them and everyone watching on those news cameras that the Vipers don't forget. That fear still rules. They'll have 3,000 people there. 3,000 people with no weapons. We checked. Sterling sent out word that everyone comes clean. No guns, no knives. They're sitting ducks. Colt's smile widened. We make an example of the town, of the Angels, of that fucking kid who thinks he's a hero. When do we ride? 4 a.m. We'll be in position by 5. As soon as the sun comes up and people start gathering, we light them up. In Pine Ridge, beneath a sky full of stars, 3,000 men and women prepared for sleep, completely unaware that the violence they'd hoped to leave behind was already on its way. Most of them had followed orders, left their weapons at home, or locked in truck safes. They'd come in peace and intended to leave the same way. But some, a handful men who'd seen too much combat to ever really relax, felt something wrong in the air. A tension that had nothing to do with the beautiful day they'd just experienced. Bear Thompson couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent at the fairgrounds, staring at the tree line to the east, and remembered a night in Fallujah when he'd felt this same unease. 3 hours later, mortars had rained down. He'd learned to trust that feeling. He pulled out his phone and texted Hawk. Something's wrong, don't know what. But something. The response came immediately. Feel it too. Stay sharp. In Pine Ridge, Sheriff Roy Bennett also couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk in the empty station, staring at reports that said everything was fine, and knowing in his gut that fine was about to end. The same instinct that had kept him alive in Vietnam was screaming now, warning of danger he couldn't see, but could feel approaching like a change in air pressure before a storm. He picked up his phone and called Hawk. They needed to talk. Sheriff, Hawk answered on the first ring, voice alert, not sleeping either. I think tomorrow's going to be different than we planned, Bennett said without preamble. You feel it too. Yeah, and if I've learned anything in 74 years, it's to trust that feeling. What do you want to do? Bennett looked out his window at the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, at the small town that had somehow become the center of something much larger than itself. We prepare, he said, together. And in that moment, an alliance was forged between a small-town sheriff and a motorcycle club sergeant-at-arms, 2 men from different worlds united by the understanding that sometimes the only thing standing between peace and violence is the willingness to stand at all. They would be tested before the sun set again. But tonight they made plans, quiet, careful plans, because protecting what mattered required more than good intentions. It required action. And both men, each shaped by their own wars, understood that better than most. The call went out at 2:47 in the morning, not loud or panicked, just a quiet mobilization through encrypted channels and whispered conversations. The network that had brought 3,000 riders to Pine Ridge now activated for a different purpose. Hawk's text was simple: possible hostile action dawn. Defensive positions only. Protect civilians. Do not engage unless fired upon. This was not what they'd come for. But they would handle it anyway. Within 30 minutes, the fairgrounds had transformed. The men and women who'd spent the day fixing fences and buying meals and donating money now moved with different purpose. Not aggressive, defensive, creating layered protection around the areas where civilians might gather. Motorcycles repositioned to create barriers. The veterans among them, and there were many, took up positions with clear sightlines. The few who'd ignored orders and brought weapons loaded them with grim efficiency, hoping they wouldn't be needed, but prepared nonetheless. Wrench Carlson, who'd done 2 tours in Iraq, established a perimeter watch. 6 riders with binoculars rotating every hour, watching the roads for incoming threats. When the first report came through at 4:30, his voice was steady and professional. Movement on Route 70, multiple vehicles, no lights, estimate 15 to 20 individuals. Hawk keyed his radio. All units acknowledge. Defensive positions. No one fires first. Everyone copies. A chorus of acknowledgments came back. They understood. This wasn't about starting a war, it was about ending one before it claimed innocence. Sheriff Bennett arrived at the fairgrounds at 4:45 with every deputy Pine Ridge had. 7 men, most of them older, none of them combat veterans. They looked nervous, but determined. Sheriff Hawk greeted him. "Vipers are inbound. We've got them on visual about 3 miles out." "How many?" "Best estimate 18 armed riders." Bennett did the math. 18 against 3,000 plus 7 deputies. The Vipers were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. "We need to evacuate the town," Bennett said. "At 5 in the morning, we'd cause a panic. And if the Vipers hear sirens, they might accelerate their timeline." "So what's the play?" Hawk looked at the eastern sky where the first hints of gray were bleeding into black. "We wake people up. Quietly. We tell them what's coming. And we give them a choice. Shelter in place or come here where we can protect them. You want civilians in the line of fire. I want civilians to understand they have power, that 18 men with guns don't get to dictate how this town lives." Hawk's jaw set. "The Vipers want fear. We give them unity instead." Bennett was quiet for a long moment, torn between protocol and instinct. Protocol said secure the threat, then worry about civilians. Instinct said that protocol was written by people who'd never had to make these kinds of choices. "All right," he decided, "but we do this smart. My deputies take the east side closest to the Vipers' approach. Your people take the west. Nobody approaches the threat directly. Nobody engages unless they shoot first. And anyone who wants to shelter in place, they shelter. No judgment." Agreed. They divided the town into sectors. 60 bikers paired with deputies moving door to door in the pre-dawn darkness, knocking quietly, speaking softly, explaining the situation with the calm directness of people who knew panic was the real enemy. Hawk and Raven took Willow Creek Road again. Maggie's porch light was already on when they pulled up. The old woman stood in the doorway wearing a bathrobe and holding a baseball bat with an ease that suggested she knew how to use it. "I heard motorcycles," she said by way of greeting. "What's wrong?" Hawk told her. "Everything. The Black Vipers approaching from the east. The 18 men with guns. The plan to wake the town and give people a choice between sheltering or gathering at the fairgrounds, where 3,000 bikers and 7 deputies would form a defensive perimeter." Maggie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down the baseball bat and crossed her arms, and Hawk recognized the gesture. Grandmother making a decision that would affect her grandson. The most important decision in the world. "Ethan's asleep," she said. "And he's staying that way. That boy's been through enough." "Yes, ma'am," Raven said quickly. "We're not asking you to wake him. We're just telling you what's happening so you can decide how to handle it. You can stay here, lock the doors, keep him safe, or you can come to the fairgrounds where we'll have maximum protection. Either way, we'll have people watching this house specifically." "Why would I come to the fairgrounds?" "Because that's where everyone who's choosing to stand together will be," Raven said, and her voice held a conviction that made the words more than just tactics. "Because sometimes the safest place in a storm is in the middle of people who refuse to run." Maggie looked at Raven for a long moment, these 2 mothers who'd lost children, finding themselves making decisions about protecting one who remained. Give me 10 minutes to get dressed and wake Ethan. We're coming. Are you sure? Positive. My grandson taught me something this week. He taught me that running from fear doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone. By 4:30, the fairgrounds had transformed yet again. The bikers were still there, 3,000 strong, but they weren't alone anymore. Pine Ridge had come out. Not everyone. Maybe half the town had chosen to shelter in place, boarding up windows and locking doors and waiting for whatever came next. And no one blamed them. Fear was reasonable. Fear kept you alive. But the other half had made a different choice. Mrs. Dillard arrived in her ancient pickup truck with her daughter Betty and 3 grandchildren. She set up her folding table and started making coffee using a generator someone had donated, because if the world was ending, it wasn't ending without caffeine. Harold Martinez and Tom Bishop arrived in matching VFW jackets and took up positions near the perimeter, their old eyes sharp despite the early hour, their hands steady from decades of handling weapons. Maria Patterson showed up with her first aid kit expanded to the size of a suitcase. I was an EMT in college, she announced to anyone who'd listen. If shooting starts, I'm the triage station. Don't anybody dare die on me. Store owners came, mechanics, parents with teenagers who were old enough to understand the risk and chose to come anyway. Elderly couples who remembered when Pine Ridge was even smaller and everyone knew everyone, and you didn't hide from trouble because there was nowhere to hide anyway. They came because yesterday 3,000 strangers had fixed their fences and filled their donation boxes and reminded them that community wasn't something you had. It was something you chose. Sheriff Bennett stood on the bed of his pickup truck at 5:15 and addressed the crowd. His voice was strong, amplified by a bullhorn carrying across the fairgrounds and probably into the tree line where 18 men waited. Most of you know me, Bennett began, and the crowd quieted. Known me for 20 years. Some of you know I served in Vietnam. Came home in 1972 with nightmares I'm still having 54 years later. Spent half a century trying to forget what brotherhood felt like because remembering hurt too much. His voice cracked slightly, the emotion breaking through professional composure. Yesterday, these riders came to our town, and I was scared. Thought they'd bring violence. Thought they'd bring Kate. Instead, they brought honor. They fixed our school, fixed my patrol car, left $87,000 for our kids. They reminded me what I'd forgotten. He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. Bikers and townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder in the pre-dawn cold breath, steaming in the air, united by something that transcended leather and badges and all the artificial divisions that usually kept people apart. There are men in those trees who want us to be afraid, who want us to scatter, who think 18 guns can break 3,000 hearts. His voice hardened, the steel of a man who'd survived a war and come home to build a life in spite of it. They're wrong, because this town doesn't break. This town stands, and today we stand together. The crowd erupted, not with cheers exactly, with something quieter and more powerful, a rumble of agreement, a collective decision made in the dark, a choice to be brave when running would be easier. Hawk climbed up beside Bennett, his presence transforming the moment from town defiance to unified front. If they shoot, we don't shoot back blindly. Everyone gets down, gets behind cover, stays low. The deputies and the armed members will return fire at confirmed targets only. Everyone else focuses on protecting the people next to you. What about the Vipers? Someone shouted from the crowd. We've sent word to the state police and FBI, Bennett answered. They're en route, but they're 40 minutes out. So we need to hold this line for 40 minutes. Can we do that? The response was a roar. Yes, hell yes, we stand, we hold. Hawk's voice cut through the noise. Then get to positions, civilians behind the barriers, veterans and armed members on the perimeter. Everyone else ready to help move people if things go bad. And remember what that boy said yesterday. He gestured to where Ethan stood with Maggie, the small figure in an oversized vest, looking scared but determined. Be brave, help people, be kind. That's our job today, not killing, protecting. The crowd dispersed with surprising efficiency, people finding positions, checking on neighbors, forming the kind of organic community response that emergency planners dream about but rarely see. Maggie Walker knelt behind a tipped Harley with Ethan pressed against her side. The boy was awake now, fully dressed in the clothes she'd helped him into in the dark of their house. His small face was pale but calm, too calm for an 8-year-old facing armed attackers. "Grandma," he whispered, "are the bad men really coming? They're trying to baby, but we're not letting them hurt anybody. Is this because of me, because I helped Miss Raven?" Maggie turned to look at him, this small boy carrying guilt too heavy for his shoulders. "Listen to me, Ethan Walker. What's happening right now is because bad people make bad choices. You made a good choice. You saved someone's life. What they're doing, that's on them, not on you, you understand?" He nodded slowly. "Okay." Raven positioned herself near Maggie and Ethan, her good arm holding a radio, her injured arm pressed against her side. Every instinct screamed at her to grab them both, throw them in a vehicle and drive until Tennessee was a memory. But there was nowhere to run. The Vipers were between them and the highway. The only way out was through, and through meant standing. The first light of dawn broke at 5:47. Gray and cold, the sun crawling over the Tennessee hills like something reluctant to witness what came next. The fairgrounds were silent despite holding nearly 5,000 people. Everyone watching the eastern tree line. Everyone waiting. And then they came. 18 motorcycles emerged from the forest like something out of a nightmare. Black paint. Unfamiliar patches. The riders wore helmets with dark visors, their faces hidden, bodies tense with violent intent. They spread out along the tree line, creating a firing line. Hawk watched through binoculars, his voice steady on the radio. "Everyone down. Civilians behind cover. This is not a drill." The crowd moved like a single organism. Bikers formed the front line, their bodies becoming shields. Townspeople crouched behind the improvised barriers of tipped motorcycles and hay bales, and whatever else had been pressed into service. Parents covered children with their own bodies. The elderly were moved to the most protected positions, and then everything stopped. A single shot split the air, not aimed at the crowd, aimed at the sky, a warning, a declaration. Then a voice amplified by a megaphone cutting through the morning air with casual cruelty. "Hell's Angels, you made us look weak. You played heroes for these people. But today they see the truth. Fear still rules." Colt Harper. Even through the distortion, Hawk recognized the voice that had haunted his nightmares since Raven disappeared. The voice that had given the orders to chain his wife to a tree and leave her to die. Hawk stood slowly, deliberately, stepping out from behind cover despite hands reaching to pull him back. He walked forward 10 paces, making himself a target, drawing fire away from the civilians behind him. "Colt," he shouted, "this doesn't have to happen. We came in peace. We'll leave in peace. Nobody else needs to get hurt." "Your wife was supposed to die in those woods." Colt's voice came back, and there was something broken in it, something that went beyond anger into genuine madness. "Supposed to send a message, but some fucking kid found her. Ruined everything. Made us look weak." "An 8-year-old boy showed mercy," Hawk shouted back. "Something you wouldn't understand if you tried." "Mercy is weakness. Then I guess we're all weak." Hawk's voice carried across the fairgrounds, across the tree line, probably carrying into town. "Because everyone here chose mercy over fear, chose standing together over running away. That's not weakness, Colt. That's the strongest thing humans can do." A pause, then Colt's voice colder now, calculation replacing rage. "Let's test that theory." The second shot hit a motorcycle 20 feet from where Hawk stood. The gas tank ruptured, fuel spraying across the pavement in a fan of combustible liquid. Someone had a lighter in their hand before they thought better of it, the instinct to smoke overriding common sense. The fuel ignited with a soft whoomp flame spreading across the dirt. Chaos threatened to erupt. Not panic exactly, but the edge of it, people's breathing, getting faster, movements becoming jerky. But then voices cut through. Calm voices. Experienced voices. "Everybody stay down. Don't run. Running makes you a target. Fire's contained. Stay in position." The discipline held. Barely, but it held. Hawk's radio crackled. Multiple hostiles raising weapons. "They're going to fire into the crowd." And that's when Ethan stood up. "Get down." 3 people shouted simultaneously, hands reaching for him, but the boy was too fast, too determined. He didn't run toward the Vipers or away from them. He ran toward the center of the fairgrounds, where a flagpole stood, the American flag hanging limp in the still morning air. Maggie tried to grab him, but he slipped through her fingers like water. Raven lunged, but her injured arms slowed her down. Hawk turned, horror dawning as he realized what the boy was doing. The shooting started in earnest then, not aimed at Ethan, not yet, but at the gathered crowd. Bullets struck motorcycles, hit the ground. One round sparked off the metal pole of Mrs. Dillard's coffee station, sending the pot spinning to shatter against the dirt. But Ethan didn't stop. He ran with the straight-line determination of a child who'd made a decision, and nothing, not fear or bullets, or the screams of adults yelling his name, would deter him. He reached the flagpole and grabbed the rope with small hands that shook but held steady. "Cease fire," Hawk roared into his radio. "Everyone cease fire now!" The bikers who'd been preparing to return fire lowered their weapons. The deputies did the same. In the sudden relative quiet, with only the Vipers still shooting, Ethan's small voice carried across the fairgrounds. "Stop it!" he shouted toward the tree line. "Just stop!" He started raising the flag. The fabric lifted slowly into the dawn light, red and white and blue low against the gray sky. Tears ran down his face, cutting clean tracks through the dust, but his voice was steady. "You're being mean," he shouted, his child's voice breaking on the words. "We didn't do anything to you. We just help people. Why do you want to hurt people who help?" The shooting from the tree line stopped. 18 men with guns, hardened criminals who had made careers of violence and intimidation, went absolutely silent. Because an 8-year-old boy was standing in an open field raising the American flag, crying openly, and asking them why. It was the simplest question, the most devastating question. Why do you want to hurt people who help? No complex moral philosophy, no appeals to law or justice or consequences. Just a child asking why kindness deserved violence. Hawk started toward Ethan, moving fast but not running, not wanting to trigger a response from the Vipers. Raven was right behind him, her face white with terror. Maggie followed, moving faster than her 67 years should have allowed. They reached him together as the flag reached the top of the pole. Hawk dropped to one knee beside the boy, his massive frame shielding Ethan from the tree line. His voice came out, rough, scraped, raw by fear and pride, and too many emotions to name. "Kid, that was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen." "You said brave means helping even when you're scared," Ethan said through his tears. "I'm really, really scared, but they need to stop." The flag snapped in a breeze that hadn't been there seconds before. Ethan's small hands secured the rope with shaking fingers, completing what he'd started. In the tree line movement, the Vipers conferring, their voices too distant to hear. 18 men trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out how to respond to a child who'd walked into a firefight armed with nothing but a question and a flag. Then engines started, not revving in challenge or aggression, just starting. The mechanical sound of defeat accepting itself. Colt's voice came one last time through the megaphone, but the rage was gone, replaced by something that might have been confusion, or might have been the first crack in whatever madness had driven him here. "This isn't over." But everyone who heard it knew it was a lie. It was over. Ethan had ended it with a question that had no good answer. The Vipers pulled back into the trees, their engines fading into the distance, 18 men retreating from an army of 5,000 because one small boy had asked them why. The fairgrounds erupted, not with cheers but with something deeper, a collective exhale, the sound of 5,000 people releasing breath they hadn't known they were holding. Relief and disbelief and overwhelming gratitude mixing into a sound that was almost like prayer. Maggie grabbed Ethan and held him so tight he squeaked, "Don't you ever, ever do that again." "Are they gone?" His voice was muffled against her shoulder. "Yeah, baby, they're gone." "Why were they so mean?" "Because some people are, and that's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Sheriff Bennett's voice crackled over every radio simultaneously. "State police just radioed in. They intercepted the Vipers 3 miles east on Route 70. All 18 in custody. It's over. It's really over." The response was instantaneous. Real cheering this time. Whoops and hollers and people hugging strangers, because in that moment everyone was family. Everyone had stood together and survived. Bear Thompson, his thigh wrapped in fresh bandages from a bullet graze he'd taken in the initial volley, raised his fist from where he sat against a motorcycle. Kids got bigger balls than all 3,000 of us combined. Ethan looked confused. What does that mean? Means you're a hero twice over, Raven said, tears streaming down her bruised face. Means you just taught 18 armed men that courage doesn't come from guns. It comes from having the guts to ask why. The sun fully cleared the hills and the gray dawn gave way to gold. The flag Ethan had raised caught the light rippling in a breeze that seemed to have arrived just for this moment. News helicopters circled overhead cameras, capturing everything. The overturned motorcycles, the bullet holes in the pavement, the 5,000 people standing together in a fairground that had almost become a battlefield. And in the center of it all, an 8-year-old boy wearing an oversized vest that said honorary guardian, standing between his grandmother and the two bikers who had claimed him as family, crying but safe, scared but brave, having just changed the world for the second time in a week. The national news would later call it the Pine Ridge Standoff, would interview experts about de-escalation tactics and the psychology of violence and the power of innocence in the face of evil. Think pieces would be written, academic papers drafted, security consultants would study the defensive formation and community mobilization. But the people who were there called it something simpler. They called it the morning a child raised a flag and reminded everyone watching that mercy wasn't weakness, that standing together wasn't surrender, that the opposite of fear wasn't violence but love expressed in its most practical, powerful form. The aftermath unfolded in waves. First came the police. State troopers and FBI agents flooding the fairgrounds, taking statements, photographing the scene, collecting shell casings, and documenting bullet impacts. The crime scene analysis would take hours, but the conclusion was already clear. 0 civilian casualties, 19 Hells Angels injured, 3 seriously. Bear Thompson's bullet grazed to the thigh. 2 others with more significant gunshot wounds being loaded into ambulances, conscious and stable but needing surgery. 17 total with minor injuries from ricochets or diving for cover or flying debris. But not a single townsperson harmed. Not one. Sheriff Bennett stood with a state police captain named Morrison watching paramedics work and heard himself being asked the question that would be repeated in debriefings for months. How did you manage 0 civilian casualties in a firefight with 18 armed assailants? Bennett looked at the captain, this crisp professional who'd probably been to 100 crime scenes but never to one like this. The bikers formed a human shield, put their bodies between the shooters and the civilians, took the bullets themselves. Morrison blinked. Say that again. You heard me. 3,000 motorcycle club members, people the media calls dangerous criminals, used themselves as shields to protect a small town they'd never been to before yesterday. That's... Morrison trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Unprecedented, Bennett suggested. Unbelievable. Yeah, it's both. But I watched it happen. Every one of those injured bikers took their hit protecting someone else. Bear Thompson. He pointed to the massive man being helped into an ambulance. He got shot covering Mrs. Dillard and her grandson, refused treatment until the medics confirmed the kid was okay. Morrison made notes, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to something like wonder. This is going to be studied for years. Good. Maybe someone will learn something. At the Walker house, Maggie finally managed to get Ethan inside and settled on the couch with Copper curled against his legs. The boy was shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off, reality settling in. He'd stood in an open field during a shootout. He'd been seconds away from being killed. The knowledge sat heavy on his small shoulders. Raven had followed them home, refusing to leave until she knew Ethan was okay. Now she sat beside him, her good arm around his shoulders while Maggie made hot chocolate in the kitchen because hot chocolate fixed everything. Or at least that's what grandmothers had believed for generations. You scared me, Raven said softly. When you stood up, when you ran to that flag, I thought my heart was going to stop. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be aware. Be aware of how important you are. To your grandmother, to Hawk and me, to 3,000 people who would have been devastated if something happened to you. But you all were in danger. All those people, because of me. Oh, no, Ed. Raven turned him to face her, her hands gentle on his shoulders. Because of bad men who made bad choices. You made a good choice. You stopped them without anyone dying. Do you understand how incredible that is? I just asked them why. Exactly, you asked the one question they couldn't answer. Why hurt people who help? There is no good answer to that. And you knew it, even if you didn't know you knew it. Maggie returned with 3 mugs of hot chocolate, the kind with marshmallows floating on top that would melt into sweet goo if you waited long enough. They sat together in the living room, sipping chocolate and not talking about what had just happened because talking about it made it too real. Instead, they talked about normal things, about Copper needing a bath because he'd rolled in something dead and smelled like a landfill, about the garden out back and whether the tomatoes would make it one more week before the frost killed them, about the small, ordinary concerns of people living ordinary lives. And slowly the shaking stopped. The fear receded. And Ethan, being 8 years old and resilient in the way children are, started to drift off exhaustion, pulling him down into sleep. Raven carefully extracted herself, letting him slump against his grandmother. I should go. Hawk will want to know he's okay. Maggie walked her to the door. Thank you for being here, for caring about him. Thank you for raising someone who cares about strangers. That's rarer than you think. They stood in the doorway, 2 women who'd been strangers 5 days ago, and now felt like they'd known each other for years. Grief did that sometimes. Shared trauma, shared love for a small boy who'd accidentally brought them together. You'll come back, Maggie asked. For visits, he'd like that. Every Sunday, Raven promised. If that's okay, we'll make it a tradition. Sunday dinners. I'd like that. They hugged, brief and awkward, 2 people who weren't huggers learning to be. Then Raven walked to her borrowed motorcycle and rode back to the fairgrounds, where Hawk was coordinating with police and organizing the departure logistics for 3,000 people who needed to start heading home. In the weeks that followed, Pine Ridge transformed in ways both expected and surprising. The $87,000 grew. Donations poured in from across the country, people who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to be part of something that proved kindness could win. The total reached 400,000 before the town council finally stopped accepting money, overwhelmed by the generosity. They rebuilt the elementary playground with the funds, not just repaired it, but completely rebuilt it into something spectacular. New swings, a climbing structure that looked like a castle, soft rubber surfaces instead of wood chips, and in the center a bronze plaque mounted on a stone pedestal, Guardians Park, in honor of Ethan Walker, who taught us courage, and the children of Pine Ridge who deserve to play in peace. The community clinic received a complete renovation. A new wing added specifically for mental health services, counseling rooms, group therapy spaces, a kids' play area where anxious children could feel safe while waiting. The name over the door, Raven Sterling Recovery Center, because the woman who'd survived being chained to a tree now led grief counseling sessions twice a week, helping others carry losses she understood too well. She drove 2 hours each way from Nashville every Tuesday and Thursday, refusing payment, saying this was what healing looked like for her. The Hells Angels established something new, not just a charitable program, but a complete restructuring of how they engage with communities. The Guardian Protocol, they called it. Chapters across the country partnered with local towns for ongoing service projects, veterans' home repairs, school support, youth mentorship. The leather and the patches became symbols not of fear, but of showing up when it mattered. It wouldn't change their reputation overnight. Decades of news coverage and movie portrayals couldn't be undone in months. But it was a start. Sheriff Bennett's Veterans Support Group became something he'd never expected it to be. The first meeting after the standoff had 60 men crammed into the VFW hall, half of them bikers, half local vets, all of them carrying invisible wounds that were somehow easier to bear when carried together. They met every Thursday at 7 p.m. No agenda, no formal structure, just coffee and folding chairs and men speaking a language that civilians couldn't quite understand, talking about the dreams that still came, the sounds that still triggered, the way even 40 years later you could be standing in a grocery store and suddenly be back there wherever there had been for you. Bennett stopped hiding his tremor, stopped pretending his hands didn't shake. Because Hawk's hands shook too, and Bear's and half the men in that room. It wasn't weakness, it was just proof that some things leave marks that don't heal, only fade. Mrs. Dillard expanded her diner, added 20 seats, hired 2 new waitresses. The back wall became a photo gallery, images from the day 3,000 bikers came to town. In the center, enlarged to poster size, was a picture that would eventually be seen around the world. Ethan raising the flag, his small frame backlit by dawn, his face set with determination that seemed impossible for 8 years old. The American flag halfway up the pole catching the first light, and in the background out of focus but present, the silhouettes of 5,000 people watching a child end a war. That photograph would win awards, would be published in Time and Newsweek and newspapers across the globe, would become an iconic image of innocence confronting violence and somehow impossibly winning. But to Mrs. Dillard, it was just Ethan, the Walker boy, who came in every Wednesday after school and ordered a grilled cheese and chocolate milk and always said please and thank you and left his change in the tip jar. The Black Vipers faced federal charges: conspiracy to commit murder, armed assault, domestic terrorism because their intent to kill civilians for political effect met the legal definition. Colt Harper took a plea deal after his attorney explained that going to trial would result in multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. 25 years. Federal prison, no parole. During his sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. Colt stood shackled and jumpsuited, looking smaller somehow than he had in his vest and helmet. He looked at the gallery where Hawk and Raven sat with Ethan and Maggie, the four of them presenting a united front. "That kid," Colt said quietly, "the one with the flag. I couldn't shoot at him, none of us could. How do you shoot at someone that asking is you wipe?" He paused. "I don't know if he saved my life by stopping me from killing him, but he saved my soul, for whatever that's worth now." The judge didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Colt Harper was led away to begin a sentence that would likely end with him dying in federal custody. But his words stayed with Ethan, who'd been in the courtroom at Hawk's invitation, who'd needed to see this part of the story too. Needed to understand that his question, his simple childish why, had reached somewhere deep even in men who'd come to kill him. For Ethan, life slowly found a new rhythm. School continued, though he was no longer invisible. The quiet kid in the back row had become the kid who saved the biker's wife and stopped a gunfight with a flag. Some classmates treated him like a hero, others like a freak. Most just didn't know what to make of him. He preferred the teachers who treated him normally. Mrs. Anderson, who still called on him for math problems and didn't make a big deal about his story. Mr. Foster, who coached Little League and cared more about Ethan's batting stance than his 15 minutes of fame. The vest hung in his closet. He wore it for special occasions. The anniversary ride, Guardian Protocol events. But not every day. It was important, but it wasn't him. What was him was feeding Copper, reading about constellations, helping Maggie in the garden. The ordinary small things that made life feel like life instead of a story other people told about you. But every Sunday at 5 o'clock, Maggie drove them to a house on Ridgeback Road for dinner. The tradition started the first Sunday after the standoff and never stopped. Hawk and Raven hosting, Maggie bringing side dishes, Ethan helping set the table. The gathering grew organically. Bear Thompson with his leg in a brace at first, then without it as he healed. Sheriff Bennett, who fit in better than anyone expected. Mrs. Dillard and her daughter Betty, Maria Patterson, Harold Martinez, and Tom Bishop from the VFW. A rotating cast of bikers and townspeople who'd been there that morning, who'd stood together, who'd become something more than neighbors. They'd become family. The first Sunday dinner had 20 people crammed around a table meant for 12. Hawk cooked ribs, his specialty, slow-smoked for hours until the meat fell off the bone. Raven made cornbread from her grandmother's recipe. Maggie brought her famous apple pie. There was more food than 20 people could reasonably eat, but that was the point. Abundance. Generosity, the physical manifestation of love. Before they ate, Hawk always asked someone to say grace, usually Ethan. The boys' prayers got simpler as weeks turned to months. Thank you for this food, for these people, for being safe. Amen. Short, direct, true. Nobody minded the simplicity. If anything, they appreciated it. After everything they'd been through, elaborate prayers felt wrong. Simple gratitude felt exactly right. On a Sunday in late November, 6 weeks after the standoff, Raven asked Ethan to stay after dinner. She and Hawk had something to show him. They led him to the garage behind the house where a shape about 3 feet tall sat covered with a tarp. "We wanted to give you something," Raven said. Her voice was gentle, the way it always was with Ethan, like she was handling something precious and fragile. "To say thank you." Not just for saving me in the woods, though, that too. For what you did at the fairgrounds. For reminding all of us who we're supposed to be. Hawk pulled back the tarp. Underneath was a motorcycle. Not full-size. A small dirt bike custom painted in dark blue with silver accents that caught the garage light. On the gas tank, hand-painted in careful script, Ethan's ride. "You're 8, Hawk said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. "Too young to ride on the road. But there's a track behind the house. Private property. And Raven and I decided that if you want to learn, we'll teach you." Ethan stared at the bike. His bike. The paint was so perfect, it looked like it belonged in a showroom. Chrome gleamed. The seat was soft leather, sized just right for him. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever owned. "I don't know how to ride," he said quietly, overwhelmed. "That's why we teach you," Raven said. "You don't have to if you don't want to. This isn't pressure, it's an option. A choice, but we thought maybe you'd like to know what it feels like. The road, the freedom, the wind." "Can I try?" Hawk grinned, the expression transforming his face from intimidating to almost boyish. "That's my boy." They spent the next hour on the track behind the house. Hawk running beside the bike, one hand on the seat, while Ethan learned to balance. Raven watching from the porch, her injured arm healed, now her face lighter than it had been in 7 years. Ethan fell twice. Got back up twice. The third time Hawk let go without telling him, and Ethan rode 20 feet before he realized he was alone. Completely, gloriously alone. Just him and the machine and the feeling of movement and control and possibility. "I'm doing it," he shouted, his voice high with surprise and joy. "I'm really doing it." "Yeah, you are," Hawk shouted back, running alongside, laughing like he hadn't laughed in months. From the porch, Maggie watched her grandson ride in circles, and the weight she'd been carrying since her son died felt lighter. Not gone, never gone, but lighter, because Ethan was laughing, really laughing, the sound of a child who'd been through darkness and found light on the other side. That night back at the farmhouse, Ethan couldn't stop talking about the bike, how it felt, how fast he'd gone, probably 10 miles per hour, but it felt like 100. How Hawk said he was a natural, which probably wasn't true, but was still the best compliment Ethan had ever received. "Can I go back next Sunday?" he asked Maggie as she tucked him into bed. "Every Sunday if you want." "I want." She kissed his forehead, breathing in the smell of little boy and grass and the faint exhaust from the dirt bike. "I'm proud of you, baby. Your parents would be too." "Do you think they can see me from heaven?" "I do. I think they're watching everything you do, and I think they're so, so proud." Ethan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then Grandma. "Are Hawk and Raven my family now?" Maggie sat back down on the edge of his bed, recognizing that this question deserved more than a quick answer. "Family isn't just blood, Ethan. It's people who show up, who stay, who see you when you feel invisible, and help you when you're scared. Hawk and Raven are family. Bear is family. Sheriff Bennett is family. All those people at Sunday dinner, they're family. Because I saved Raven. No, sweetheart, you were family the moment you held her hand in those woods. Everything else just helped everyone else figure out what she already knew." Ethan processed this, his 8-year-old brain working through concepts that some adults never mastered. "I'm glad they're family." "Me too, baby, me too." She left him to sleep, and in the darkness, Ethan stared at the ceiling and thought about the day, the motorcycle, the track, Hawk's laugh, Raven's smile, the family that wasn't born, but chosen. He thought about his parents, wondered if they could really see him from wherever they were, wondered if they knew he was okay, more than okay, wondered if they approved of the choices he'd made, the people he'd let into his life, the vest hanging in his closet that said he mattered to thousands of people he'd never met. He'd like to think they did, like to think they were proud. And in the space between waking and sleeping, where the world softens and truth feels closer, Ethan heard his mother's voice. Not real, just memory. But memory was enough. "You did good, baby. You did so good." He fell asleep smiling, safe in a house that loved him, part of a community that had chosen courage, connected to a network of people who would always, always have his back. And somewhere in Nashville, in a modest house that smelled like motor oil and leather Hawk Sterling, held his wife while she cried happy tears for the first time since they'd lost their daughter 7 years ago. "We have a son," she whispered into his chest. "Not by blood, but by choice, mon doute." "Yeah," Hawk said, his own voice thick. "We do." They'd come to Pine Ridge to honor a debt, to say thank you to a child who'd shown courage when adults had failed. But they were leaving with something more valuable than gratitude. They were leaving with family, with purpose, with a reminder that the world, despite all its darkness, still had light worth protecting. And in the morning, they'd wake up and do the work. The Guardian Protocol, the veteran support groups, the Sunday dinners, all of it. Because that's what family did. They showed up, they stayed. They chose love over fear again and again until the choice became identity. The road continued, it always did. But now they knew where it led, not to violence or chaos or any of the things people feared when they saw motorcycle clubs. It led home, to a small farmhouse on Willow Creek Road where an 8-year-old boy fed a beagle named Copper and helped his grandmother in the garden. To a table set for 20, where strangers became family over ribs and cornbread and apple pie. To a future where courage wasn't loud or dramatic, but quiet and persistent and choosing to help even when it would be easier not to. The watch continued. The Guardians stayed vigilant. And in Pine Ridge, Tennessee, a small town that had almost been destroyed by fear, learned instead to live by love. And that more than any dramatic rescue or firefight or moment of individual heroism was the real victory. Because the smallest act of courage repeated over and over, day after day, by ordinary people making extraordinary choices could change the world. Ethan Walker had proven that, and 3,000 riders plus one small town would spend the rest of their lives proving it again. The story didn't end there. Stories like this never really end. They just keep rippling outward, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, creating chain reactions that echo through generations. But if there was an ending to this chapter, it would be this: on a cold December evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall on Pine Ridge, 5,000 people gathered, not in fear, but in celebration. The town Christmas festival expanded this year to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Lights strung between buildings, vendors selling hot chocolate and roasted nuts, children running between stalls, their laughter cutting through the cold air. And in the center of it all, a Christmas tree donated by the Hells Angels, Tennessee, chapter 30 feet tall, covered in ornaments made by elementary school students. At the top, instead of a star or an angel, hung a small leather vest. Honorary Guardian, catching the light, visible from every corner of the festival. Ethan stood with Maggie and Hawk and Raven looking up at it and felt something settle deep in his chest. Not pride exactly, something quieter, more like peace, Obrim. "They put my vest on the tree," he said, voice full of wonder. "Town voted on it," Hawk told him. "Unanimous. They wanted everyone to remember what matters." "What's that?" Raven knelt beside him, her eyes level with his. "That courage isn't about being strong or brave or fearless. It's about seeing someone who needs help and deciding that their need matters more than your fear. That's what you taught us. That's what this whole town learned." Ethan looked around at the festival, at Mrs. Dillard serving hot chocolate to a biker with a gray beard, at Sheriff Bennett laughing with Bear Thompson over some shared joke, at townspeople and riders mingling without tension, without fear, just people being people together. "It's nice," he said simply. "Everyone being friends." "It's more than nice, kid," Hawk said. "It's hope, real hope, the kind that doesn't come from wishing, but from choosing. Every person here chose this, chose kindness, chose community, chose to be brave like you showed them." The snow fell harder, dusting shoulders and hair collecting on the ground in a thin white blanket that made the world look clean and new. Music started playing from somewhere, Christmas carols sung slightly off-key, but with genuine joy. And as the festival continued around them, as Pine Ridge celebrated not just Christmas, but the fact that they'd all survived and chosen each other and become something better than fear, Ethan Walker felt something he hadn't felt since before his parents died. He felt like he belonged, not just to his grandmother or to Hawk and Raven or to any single person or family, but to something larger, to a community, to a network of people who'd proven that when you need them, they stay. And that was worth everything. The snow continued to fall, the lights continued to glow, the music played, and in a small town in Tennessee on a cold December evening, 5,000 people celebrated the simple truth that an 8-year-old boy had taught them. Love is stronger than fear. Kindness is braver than violence. And the smallest act of courage can change the world. This was the lesson of Pine Ridge. This was the legacy of the Guardian. And this finally was home.